Good morning. Welcome to this course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we will be focusing on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions reduction only, and largely focusing on building design and construction. I am your instructor, Professor Avlokita Agrawal. I am an associate professor at Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Previously, before this course, we have also you can go through that course, which is on sustainable architecture. So, this was the first part of the course. We are extending it because greenhouse gas emissions have become, they have caught a lot of momentum in today's times. Now, to understand what these greenhouse gas emissions are, how to reduce them, and especially focusing on the building design and construction for reducing these scope 1 and 2 emissions, this is what the scope of this course is going to be. In this first introductory lecture, I will take you through the need for understanding something like greenhouse gas emissions and how historically we have come to a point where we are talking about GHG emissions. Before we will move to greenhouse gas emissions and then understanding what is scope 1, 2 and 3, we will be starting with the understanding of sustainability, sustainable development, how historically both these terminologies have evolved and who have been the people and events which have led us to this point where further to sustainable development and the concept of sustainability, we are talking about greenhouse gas emissions in particular. Now, why at all are we talking about sustainability or a manifestation of it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Why at all are we worried, if at all we are? What sustains eventually and who are we? Very fundamental questions are required to be answered first before we move on to the greenhouse gas emissions and their understanding. Now, very quickly, why are we talking about sustainability so much? You look at anything, we talk of it in terms of sustainability, sustainable cities, sustainable buildings, sustainable transport, sustainable agriculture, sustainable industries and what not. We are talking about everything from the perspective of sustainability. Why at all are we doing that? Now, these images that you see on the screen are the reason why we are talking about sustainability. The world is, especially the environment, is under crisis. It is critical right now. Air that we used to get free to breathe is polluted. We have to invest extra in adding air purifiers in our urban homes. The land is contaminated, the water is contaminated, literally all the blessings of the nature are contaminated, polluted today, and we have to put in extra efforts, extra resources to even harness the freely available resources as they were initially. So, that is why, and we realize we are at a tipping point. Everybody is talking about climate change and global warming and change in weather pattern, food insecurities, water insecurities, electricity and energy insecurities. So, we understand that there are a lot of problems that we are talking about. Largely all these problems that I have just mentioned appear to be in the environmental domain. And this is why we are talking about sustainability. While the problems that I have just mentioned, they are not just environmental in nature. They have manifestations in social aspects, they have manifestations on economy, and it is a spiral, it is an interconnected spiral that we are talking about. And so, we are talking about sustainability, and this is not new. The discussion on sustainability is not new, is what you will quickly see in the later part of this lecture. Now, why at all are we worried? So, there is this polar bear which is standing on a small piece of cut off piece of glacier. Are you or me or anybody here worried about this polar bear? Are we really concerned that this polar bear is going to get extinct? Well, not. We are actually worried about ourselves. The second picture, we are worried about how our future generations are going to survive. Am I going to get enough water in the time to come? The air, everything that we have just talked about is a reality. I am worried about my own existence, my own sustenance. and that is why we are talking so much about all these things. Now, where is the problem? The problem, as has been very aptly put by Ramchand Guha and several other scientists and leaders and thinkers, is there are more people producing more, traveling more, consuming more and excreting more. There is so much of resource consumption and then waste production later, and all of this is together creating havoc on earth, is what we clearly realize. And the effects of these problems? Well, we have traffic congestions, the urban areas are increasing, more and more people are coming into the cities, the traffic is there is overcrowding almost everywhere, in all the urban areas you will find so much of population, wherever you go it's full of people. There are hardly any open and green areas in the urban areas, the cities of today. The cities are growing bigger and bigger and they are eating up on all the green areas that humans need to be healthy, to thrive, to sustain. Overcrowding everywhere literally. So, there is a lot of pressure on infrastructure, on resources, and these are the problems, these are the practical everyday problems that we are facing, not just in urban areas, the rural areas. The manifestation of similar problems are in some different forms, but these are the problems. Now, if these are the problems, these are the real issues, what at the end of the day will sustain? Will we sustain as human beings? Are we going to get extinct with all of that happening? Well, something sustains, and what sustains is nature. Nature will take over everything. It is always going to remain at balance. Okay, today we might be thinking that it is great imbalance that has been created in the nature. Yes, it might be, but it will shake itself to come back to a balanced position, and it will surely sustain and thrive. And in the process of that, the weaker links, the unnecessary links, the more inefficient and resource consuming links, they will all be taken away from the system, and that is what nature does. So, what sustains? It is the nature. So, are we going to sustain? Again the same question. Are human beings going to sustain? Well, we will, because we are nature. But we will sustain only if we become one with nature. We follow the rules of nature. Quickly, the four most important rules of nature is interdependency, efficiency, survival and change. If we are efficient enough, now when I say efficiency, look at a spider's web, look at a honeybee's nest, and then you will see how efficiently they have used the resources and how efficiently they are putting them to use, taking least from the nature and producing an equal amount is the efficiency we are talking about. Unfortunately, we are not living our lives like that. We are consuming way more than what we can give back to the nature, and in fact, the resources that we are consuming, we are wasting them, and when we are giving it back to the nature, it is a wasted product. We take fresh water, we give back to the nature sewage. We take in fresh air, we give to the nature polluted air from our industries, from our vehicles, from our buildings, everywhere, and that is what we are doing. This is not efficient. Then we have to be interdependent. We can't think that we are the only ones who are surviving. We are interdependent. The jungles, we depend on them, and the jungles have to be taken care of by us. And it is not just that, almost everything in nature, it is interdependent. That is the fundamental understanding of sustainability. Anything that sustains, it sustains as a system. An individual does not sustain. So, we have to understand and we have to be more and more aware that we are interdependent. There are so many other entities which are interrelated. We are interrelated with them. A lot of times human beings, as all of us, we have started to think that we are supreme, we are above everything, but eventually, and the recent events have very clearly proved that we are not. Nature is the supreme, and all of us have to understand this thing, this interdependency, this requirement for efficiency and the strength to survive. We have to be strong enough to survive, adaptive enough to survive, adaptive enough to change to the changing environment, to the changing context. So, we know how humans have evolved. That was because we were able to change ourselves, we were able to adapt to the changing context, and hence we have survived. If we have to survive further, we have to adapt ourselves even more, we have to change ourselves. That is what will sustain. So, if we follow the rules of nature, we will surely sustain, but if we do not, if we are opposite, if we are doing opposite to what the rules of nature call, then it will be difficult for human beings as a species, as a community to sustain and to survive. It might become very difficult. Well, with this as a background, that why at all are we talking about sustainability, I will quickly take you through some basic definitions and understanding of sustainability. In this course, we are not really going to talk about sustainability and sustainable development a lot, but this is going to lead us to discussing about the requirement for bringing in place a protocol such as GHG protocol. The why at all GHG protocol came into place, how did it come into place, and what are we doing about it is our ultimate intent of this course, but we have to start with this understanding of sustainability. Very quickly we will look at some definitions and concepts. So, couple of definitions, one of this is given by Thomas Jefferson Sustainability Council, is that sustainability may be described as our responsibility to proceed in a way that will sustain life, that will allow our children, grandchildren and great grandchildren to live comfortably in a friendly, clean and healthy world. I will come to another definition. If you look at only the literal meaning of sustainability, as per the Webster's New International Dictionary, it just says sustain is to cause or to continue as in existence or a certain state or in force or intensity, to keep up, especially without interruption, diminution, flagging etc., or to prolong. Another definition is from Caring for the Earth. It says improving the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. I will come to all these definitions, but sustainability is the ultimate goal and the means to achieve sustainability is sustainable development. They have very similar and sometimes confusing definitions, but sustainable development as per WBCSD, World Business Council on Sustainable Development, it says sustainable development involves the simultaneous pursuit of economic prosperity, environmental quality and social equity. Companies aiming for sustainability need to perform not against a single financial bottom line, but against the triple bottom line, and the triple bottom line here what we've been talking is of environment, economy and people, society. So, all these three have to be kept in mind while deciding, while aiming for sustainability. The most commonly adopted definition of sustainable development was given in the report Our Common Future. We will come to the historical event when this report Our Common Future was published, but it clearly mentioned, defined sustainable development as the development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This was given by the Prime Minister of Norway then in 1987, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and the report, the committee was headed by her, and the report that was produced by the committee, that was put forth by the committee, was called Our Common Future, which is where for the first time a common definition of sustainable development was commonly agreed upon. Now, before we go to understand what this Our Common Future clearly mentioned, I will come back to putting all these definitions of sustainability and sustainable development together. Now, what are we really understanding with this term sustainability and sustainable development? Two things which emerge in commonly in all the definitions is one, that we have to continue to thrive, continue to remain in a state which is good for everybody. Some people are talking about comfort, some people are talking about the quality of life, living conditions. So, we have to continue to maintain that quality of life, and the second part is without depleting or without harming the environment, or rather reducing the access of these resources for our future generations. Now, if we've already talked about the problems, why at all are we talking about sustainability? Do you think the context, the environment in which we are living, not as a natural environment, but in general everything around us is sustainable? No. And why is that? While we might argue and we might convince ourselves that we are living comfortably, the quality of life is good, but some places the quality of life may be good, but we are putting a lot of pressure on the resources. We are consuming, we are extracting resources at an alarming rate, and our future generations surely are not going to have an access to these resources. You must be reading about reports that the oil reserves are there, like whatever has been discovered so far, are available only for another 100 years or so. The coal reserves will get finished in another 70 years or so. Do we ever think that what are our future generations going to do? How will they generate electricity? If there is no fuel, how will their vehicles run? How are they going to survive? Think of a day in our life when energy is not there, when there is no energy, and still in a country like ours, India, and across the world largely, the electricity is still being produced through conventional fuel, using conventional fuel like coal and gas. What in another 100 years, when our great grandchildren would be living on this earth, they would have literally no conventional fuel available for them to commute. How will they move? How will their homes be heated or cooled? How will the entire life run? We don't think about that. So, that is the problem. Our cities are already becoming water deficient. There is hardly any water in urban areas, a lot of urban areas. On the other hand, every monsoon some cities would always flood. The life is, this is not the quality of life that we are talking about. So, in some places the resources are being consumed at a very fast pace, at an alarming rate, and in some places the quality of life is not what we really want to have. So, sustainable development is where we have the quality of life, there is comfort, there is a good life without compromising on the ability of our future generations to lead the same life. So, this is where the whole discussion about sustainability and sustainable development emerged. This is not new. We have been discussing about sustainability and sustainable development for a long time now. In different ways, the issues, the topics have been very different, but we have been discussing about them. So, for the first time, the world kind of came together and agreed that yes, we need to talk about sustainable development. So far what we have been doing, that we have been talking about prior to this, we had been talking about just the environment, or just the economy, or just the society, the lifestyle of people. But for the first time, everybody, a larger part of the world came together and agreed that all these three are somewhere connected, interconnected. So, if we really are talking about sustainable development, we can't just be talking about economy. If you remember, after industrial revolution, suddenly there was a boost in the economy. But what happened as a result of that? The environment suddenly degraded, very bad. There was a lot of inequality in the society in terms of their economic prosperity, their quality of life, lifestyle. So, there were a lot of problems which emerged, new problems which emerged, while the economy on the whole was doing better probably. So, economy was going better, but environment and society, people were not. Now, is that sustainable development? Prior to that, the environment was in good shape, good condition, but the economy wasn't. People did not have good jobs, they did not have enough resources to lead a good life. Even that was not sustainable. So, what is sustainable? There had to be some discussion on what is sustainable, what are the parameters which will actually qualify that, okay, this that we are doing is sustainable. That for the first time was discussed in this Brundtland report, or what we know as our common future, and a lot of discussion happened here. So, this was actually the basic idea or the key point that was asked to be formulated to this committee was a global agenda for change. The United Nations, the world at large, which is represented by United Nations, and this was the World Commission on Environment and Development, WCED. So, there was an urgent call by the General Assembly of United Nations that there is a need for a global agenda for change, how the world should go forward, how should we continue, and that is what this report puts forth. It puts and it proposed long-term environmental strategies for achieving sustainable development by the year 2000 and beyond. This was in 1987 that we are talking about. So, at that time there were some 13 odd years left till 2000, and the report clearly mentioned the long-term environmental strategies. It also recommended ways which were concerning for the environment, and the idea was to bring everyone together and kind of develop a cooperation, a greater cooperation amongst the developing countries, developed countries, literally everybody on board. So, that is what the idea was, because it is something, sustainable development is something, and as I have already said, that it is not about individuals. It is about everybody coming together, it is about community, it is about societies and people and taking collective action, and that is what was realized. One more thing, very interesting thing which was realized here was that people are more important than everything else. It does not mean that we put environment at risk or we put environment at stake just because people have to be comfortable or people have to be happy. No, that was not the case. But the idea emerged from the previously practiced ways where after industrial revolution people were put at the back. It was economy, it was more and more of production, it was more and more of resource consumption from the nature, and it was about making more and more money, enhancing, strengthening the economy, and people somewhere were left to the back. Here once again it was realized that people have to be brought to the fore. It is people who we are working for. So, people have to be the center of the concern. Of course, along with that, environment and economy both have to come. So, broadly if we look at this our common future, the report, first they identified the successes and failures, what have been the good case studies and not so good ones, what are the crises and how they are interconnected. So, water quality depleting in one area is definitely interlinked with weather changes in another area, or food insecurities in another one, or economic prosperity in one region was discussed and found to be interconnected with crisis in another areas. So, there was a clear understanding of this interlinked, interlocking crisis that they clearly identified and mentioned, and hence the need for sustainable development. Since it is all interconnected, sustainable development was proposed to be taking care of all of this together: environment, economy and society. So, all these three together had to be taken for this sustainable development. And what are the institutional gaps? We are talking about it, but what are the institutional gaps? Why is it not happening? There is, okay, for the first time it was put in the form of a report, but there was always a little understanding about why and where things are going wrong. So, what are the institutional gaps and where the strengthening was required? And then they proposed policy directions in the directions of population and human resources, food security, species and ecosystem, because animals, the flora, fauna, they cannot speak for themselves. We have to speak for them, humans have to speak for them, because we are the more superior of all species. We have been gifted with a lot of abilities, and so we do not just have to speak for ourselves or think of ourselves, we have to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, and here we are talking about all the animal species, all flora and fauna. So, species and ecosystems. Then energy was identified as a prominent direction for framing the policies. Everybody realized that energy is something that drives development, that drives growth. So, energy was one important chapter in the policy directions. And industries. Industry is important, there is no doubt about that, but how much and how sustainably can we continue forward is what had to be discussed, and which has been discussed. And another thing, the urban challenge. Now, before this Our Common Future report was published, prior to that also it was very clearly realized that the population of the world is increasing, it was continuing to increase, and it is still continuing to increase. And as more and more people are there on the earth, more and more people are also moving to the urban areas, and so there is going to be an urban challenge. We are talking about some 40 years back, and today also it remains as relevant as ever. The urban challenge is there. So, they propose policy directions in all these areas. And then the third thing that we had identified was this institutional gap. So, what do we do about them? So, international cooperation and institutional reform was proposed, the directions for that. So, the world had to come together. So, Our Common Future had majority of the countries as signatories, as parties. And so, what they identified was the role of international economy, how the trade should happen, how. So, it cannot be that one part of the world continues to grow while the other part of the world continues to suffer or be exploited. So, there was this role of international economy, managing the commons, peace, security and development. And we have very recently the kind of political events that have happened across the world in the last decade, a lot of wars and a lot of debates and issues in different parts of the world. We have already realized that this is surely not going to take us in the direction of sustainable development. So, peace, security, development and the environment, that is required. International cooperation on these points is required. Then institutionalizing and legalizing the change. For example, getting at the resources and getting at the sources, dealing with the effects that are, assessing global risks. This requires putting everybody together and also institutionalizing. So, specific organizations were required and they were also formulated. New organizations were formed to look into these ideas, and putting all of that together, a global call for action. So, this is what Our Common Future did, and it has been a huge success. There have been events which have followed on from 1987, and more discussion has happened. Several protocols have come into effect, several other conferences and organizations have been there, and eventually leading to what we will be talking about, GHG emissions. So, quickly going through a recap of historical evolution, sustainability has not always had the same connotation, same understanding, same meaning as we have today. Today we are more bothered, we are worried more about the environment, right? But in earlier times it was not really so. The broader concern, the major concern in earlier times, we are talking about times after industrial revolution, was human health. Cholera, pandemics such as those, they were common. So, there was a greater concern for the human health. The living conditions of people were very bad. There was a great inequality that was there in the society, especially the industrialized ones, because the ones who owned industries had a lot of resources at disposal, while the ones who worked in those industries did not have. So, there was a lot of inequality that people started to talk about, and there was a large section of the society, as you can see on the screen, who was living in very bad living conditions. Can anyone recognize this picture? Where would the street be? Well, this is the picture of a street from New York City. We cannot imagine that at one point of time, this was after Industrial Revolution, that the New York streets, a city that we've known for all the goods, looked like that. There were certain streets, and look at the life of people at that time. So, the greater concern was people, how equality can be brought to people, how resources can be made available to all classes of people is what the major discussion was. And then when more and more resources were made available, then we started talking about human health. Obesity at one point of time was a big problem. The working conditions, then we moved on to the working conditions. Can we have better working conditions in industries? People worked in industries for long hours, so there was discussion on the rights. And then in 1962, Rachel Carson brought out this book on Silent Spring, which for the first time vocally discussed about the interconnections of the development and its impact on environment. So, she had written about the spray of DDT and how it affected the water bodies and the aquatic life. And she was a doctoral student at that time, and this was part of her PhD thesis that she came out with this book, and she became revolutionary in a sense. And then that was the time 1962 onwards that the world started to talk about how the developmental activities are hampering the environment. This was first such major event, and several others have followed. But from talking about people as a problem of sustainability, the inequalities and all, we've moved to the discussion more on environment and the impact of development on environment, and it is continuing because we are, despite all this discussion, despite all this talk, we are continuing to exploit the environment. That is so unfortunate. This picture is not uncommon. Almost majority of the parts of the world have similar conditions. The water is contaminated, air is polluted and whatnot. And then we discovered this ozone hole. Okay, good news is that it is not there anymore, but because of the rampant use of conventional fuels, of more and more industries coming into picture and uncontrolled growth, uncontrolled development, it resulted in a problem, an issue as big and bad as ozone hole. So, it was not just what we were doing on earth, it was the environment beyond the surface of earth which was also getting affected, and this was an eye opener too. So, if we look at sustainability, and you might argue and discuss that how are the goalposts changing? Yes, sustainability and the discussion around sustainability has to be like that. It has to be flexible to have the changing goalposts. Today, we have more focus on environment because we think that is what is of greater concern. In say 5 decades or 8 decades back, a century back, there was a greater concern on people because that was what was needed. The focuses have been shifting. In certain parts of the world, the focus has also been on economy, economic growth. So, we can't just be talking about environment and not economy. Well, everything has to be taken together, and that is what sustainability has been. Now, quickly looking at the events. So, this was Silent Spring in 1969. I am sorry, I think I have mentioned 1962. This is 1969. And then the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. Now, all these events continue to generate awareness, and here I have taken most of the events that are, you will find they are more on environment, discussions about environment, but in between there are few on society and economy as well. Now, this is an indicator that environment is something that still needs a lot of attention and it is just continuing. In 1971, Greenpeace Canada was formed, and a crew of anti-nuclear activists, they set out to protest against US nuclear tests in Alaska. Well, eventually the tests did happen. They could not stop the tests, but it generated so much of awareness across the world about activities like the nuclear tests and others, and how they are going to impact the environment, the aquatic life, and a lot of other life forms around. In 1973, there was this Chipko movement in India. Up till this time, the argument when we were discussing about sustainability, and even after that, has been that all this discussion of sustainable development and sustainability is a full stomach phenomena. When people have resources at disposal, when their stomachs are full, when they have all the all the comforts of their life, that is when people start to talk about sustainability. Oh, then we talk about environment. Well, this particular movement proved that it is not true. These were villagers, these were the women in the village, a remote village in Uttarakhand, and as a result of a law which was passed then, the rights of the jungles were given to people other than the villagers, and those people wanted to clear the jungles. They wanted to cut the jungles, and that is when the women of this village, they hugged the trees, which we know as Chipko, and they literally bent the parties, the commercial party, they stopped them from cutting down the jungle. So, it is not always a full stomach phenomena. This whole discussion about sustainability and sustainable development is what this particular movement proved. In 1973, around the same time, there was also this OPEC oil embargo, which lasted almost some 8 odd months, and that was the time when the world realized that, oh, we cannot just depend upon conventional fuel. And that was the time when a lot of research started to happen on, because the major consumer of this energy were buildings, were people, there are living environments. So, a lot of energy actually went into that. So, there was a lot of research which was funded, one, to identify, to develop alternate sources of energy, and that is when, after this, that we had a lot of work on solar power, and wind, hydro existed, but there was a greater emphasis on that, and we started working more on alternate sources of energy rather than the conventional sources of energy. 2. So, this was on the supply side. The second part of the research which was funded especially in America and Europe was on reducing the demand. So, the demand reduction in buildings particularly was of utmost concern, and that is why we saw that across the Europe and America there was a lot of research which was conducted in passive design, passive buildings, passive heating, and materials, climate responsive architecture and all. A lot of discussion you would find if you look at research papers, you would find that this was around the same time, 1975 to 1990s, that a lot of research happened in this area. So, both supply and demand was triggered by this oil embargo, when the oil producing nations refused to sell their oil to America and Europe, some countries in Europe. After that, there have been a series of events. For example, this US enactment of the Endangered Species Act, where the rights of the endangered species and the legislation to protect the areas for endangered species was carried out. In 1983, this Development Alternatives as an organization was formed. There are several organizations, and I am skipping through a lot of events because there are many. You can find out about them, but the idea was that every citizen should be able to live a secure, healthy and fulfilling life in harmony with nature across the world. So, we are not just talking about the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, but we are talking about the entire world where people have a healthy and fulfilling life. Same time, this was the foundation was laid for Grameen Bank by Professor Muhammad Yunus, who was an economist and a revolutionary banker in Bangladesh, and this for the first time was talking about micro credits, micro loans. Till that time, a lot of loan was being made available to bigger commercial entities, and not this microfinancing scheme was his brainchild, and it has been hugely successful. So much so that across the world you would find these microfinances being available, being made available for people, especially the underprivileged ones, say women in a lot of communities, and the other underprivileged people. There was a famine in Ethiopia in 1984, where it was estimated that over 4 lakh people died. And this was also one of the events which hit the world hard and awakened everybody to the fact that what we are doing in other parts of the world is affecting people in other part of the world. So, it is all interconnected. We can't disown our responsibilities. We can't say that, okay, I haven't done or I'm not responsible for this. What we are doing here is surely affecting what is happening in some other parts of the world. That idea, that concept of everything being together, after which came our common future, that our actions of development, so called development in one part of the world is affecting lives in the other part of the world, because it is affecting environment some way or the other. So, that is how 1987 this Brundtland Commission was formed, and the report Our Common Future was published, and since then there have been a lot of new policies, like new policy on seed development because of climate change, a lot of changes that continue to come. Then we had this Earth Summit, the first Earth Summit in 1992, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and this particular summit, which was the Rio Summit, or it is also known as Earth Summit, was organized, and it was a huge success. Again, here there was a lot of consensus which was formed, and everybody agreed about the impacts of development on environment, and it gave birth to several important documents like Agenda 21, which continue to form the basis of other documents later. This was also a summit which continued to be held every 10 years. So, we had after 1992, we had another one in 2002 and 2012, which was again held in Rio, where a stock of activities which had to be, or implementation measures which were agreed upon, were their progress was monitored. There was a new commission which was formulated, Commission on Sustainable Development by United Nations. So, in 1993 there was this meeting of Commission on Sustainable Development in United Nations headquarters, which again it was tasked with overseeing the outcomes of 1992, the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit, first Earth Summit. So, this was after Earth Summit, it was an after effect of Earth Summit, and this continued to monitor how sustainable development is taking place, or how it is being taken forward. This was followed by World Summit for Social Development. So, now we are seeing that the discussion on sustainable development is not just on environment. Here we are seeing that there is a greater discussion on social development, the economic development, and of course, the environment remains at the center of majority of the discussions in sustainable development. Further formulation of policies and frameworks such as Environmental Management Standard ISO 14001 and similar events, and then came into effect Kyoto Protocol in 1997. Now, the foundations for this were laid in 1992 in the Earth Summit. Finally, this came into effect in 1997, and it was finally agreed upon in 2002, when there were sufficient number of parties, the countries which agreed to sign on that, and the whole agreement was on reducing the greenhouse gases. which is what we are talking, which will be talking about greenhouse gas emissions. So, Kyoto Protocol came as an after effect or as an output of Earth Summit. Okay, it took a lot of time to finally be ratified by a lot of parties, but Kyoto Protocol laid the foundations of understanding and reducing greenhouse gases. The entire world agreed on that, and if you will search for more data on the internet, you will find that almost all greenhouse gases, they have been rated, they have been listed for their global warming potential, and how a proper policy guideline on how these greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced from industrial units, from other production units, is what has been discussed. And this has been a successful protocol because it is currently, I think, more than 145 plus countries are party to Kyoto Protocol, and the biggest, it actually was ratified when Russia joined signed the Kyoto Protocol. There have been discussions and controversies on genetically modified organisms, and then in 2000 there was this United Nations Millennium Declaration, after which Millennium Development Goals were proposed and they were adopted to be achieved by 2015. After that, 2002, we had another summit which was a follow up of this was the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was the follow up of Rio. In 2006, there was this documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. You can go and watch, and it was an interesting, and for the first time, such an impactful documentary on climate change, and this was by Vice President Al Gore, that he made a case for climate change being real and happening around us. So, this particular documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, placed climate change at the center of the discussion, and the world started talking about climate change as a reality. We were keeping a closed eyes, a blind eye to this climate change happening, followed by Copenhagen COP15 and COP21 in Paris. So, all these events were not happening on their own as an independent event, but they had a history, and there were stock taking, there were progress checking of the actions that were started sometime in 1980s, 1970s, and how we were progressing and continuously making the countries, the states agree to follow, to implement the policies together, because the whole idea of sustainable development and moving forward to have a better environment, to have a sustainable future, is that the world has to come together. Everybody has to come together. So, that is all in this lecture. We have had a very basic understanding of how historically we have reached to a point, and we will continue discussing about that further, how we have reached to a point where we are now discussing about greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you very much for joining me today in this lecture. We will have the next lecture in this series tomorrow. So, continue to remain with us. Thank you.